Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian from Axios, the China staff writer. Bethany, great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me today.
And also from Washington, D.C., Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to have you back.
Thanks so much, Ivo.
And from his apartment in Brooklyn, Peter Spiegel, U.S. editor of the Financial Times. Great to have you as well, Peter.
The nerve center of the world, absolutely.
Well, at least the nerve center or something. We got a lot to talk about. There's a lot of things changing, but let's start, Bethany, with you and the developments in Beijing. Really important steps being taken by Xi Jinping to consolidate his power at home, even as he seemed to have been absent from the global scene at a particular important period of time. So, Bethany, bring us up to speed about what's happening in Beijing, how you see power evolving in this critical country, and what do you think it means for the country and for the world?
Sure. So what we had this week was the sixth plenum, and it's the final meeting in the top political elites in China before the party congress next year. And what we were expecting to see this week was a big sweeping statement that reevaluates the party's history and would further consolidate Xi Jinping's place as his place in terms of his leadership supremacy over the party. And that's important because it's expected that Xi Jinping is going to be appointed for a third term next year. And that would go against the norm that had been established in the past 30 years of Chinese Communist Party secretaries stepping down after two terms. So he is looking to get the political capital in place and to build consensus behind the scenes for this not unprecedented, but highly unusual move to extend his power. And we did see that statement. So yesterday, the party released a communique, and it sort of offered this sweeping view of party history and said that under Xi Jinping, the party had achieved new heights and that China had overcome many crises, and basically setting the stage for that. So that was really important. It's probably the reason that Xi Jinping did not attend COP26. He wanted to be at home to deal with, all of this sort of behind the scenes political machinations, rather than having to be stuck in quarantine and, based in Glasgow for a bit. I want to talk about just real briefly a couple of, I think that some people are saying that Xi staying home from COP26 represents him withdrawing from the world stage as part of maybe a larger trend of China withdrawing a bit or self-isolating in the face of Western hostility. And I don't think that is really the right frame for what we have been seeing. Rather, I would say that Xi Jinping is trying to change the terms upon which the rest of the world engages with China. Xi is trying to make the Chinese economy and the regulations that govern it a global standard setter. So, for example, the domestic crackdown on the Chinese tech industry is a good example of this. There have been, really tough regulations and punishments put on the Chinese tech industry, which previously had been seen as kind of almost a third power center in China. It's not, we're not going to see the Chinese tech industry collapse, and innovation is not going to cease. Rather, Xi wants to have greater political control over the tech industry, to make sure that both domestically and internationally, the industry's achievements are in line with what the party desires. The goal has been concomitant with China's growing push in standard setting in international regulatory institutions, and its growing extraterritorial use of domestic standards to influence how foreign companies change their behavior. And it's easy to see how the ability to utilize occasional control over industries to push China-friendly standards and Chinese dominance globally can benefit not just Chinese Communist Party elites, but many Chinese companies and their employees. So overall, I'd say, what we're seeing in Chinese politics right now and its relationship to China's economy is a desire to create a firm foundation for China to exert strong political influence over the shape of the global 21st century through the political control of its huge domestic markets. And that is a better, larger frame to view what happened this past week at the sixth plenum. And in fact, that is exactly what the communique that was issued states. It said, China has broken new ground in its diplomatic endeavors amid profound global changes and turned crises into opportunities. These efforts have resulted in a marked increase in China's international influence, appeal, and power to shape. So Xi Jinping's ongoing consolidation of power for himself and the party, I think, is representative of the party's view of itself as being powerful on the world stage and not being weak or under threat.
I guess there's sort of a
Bethany. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to ask, just play devil's advocate on this, because obviously it's hard to know since obviously the Chinese have really cracked down the ability of Western journalists to operate not only in mainland China but also in Hong Kong. So the reality on the ground is somewhat nebulous. But you see a leader here who, as you said, is cracking down on the tech industry domestically for worry that it is a alternate power source. Obviously, the rounding up of the Uyghurs and the concentration camps been set up there, the crackdown on and the expulsion of Western media. I mean, you do, and the fact that he's decided to stay home because he's worried about domestic, as you said, sort of build up to the recent announcement. That doesn't seem to me like a person who is particularly comfortable with the situation at home. Why the need to crack down at any semblance of any third, civil power outside the party if you were actually securing the ability to achieve leader for life status?
I guess my perspective on that is, if you look at China from an international perspective, what consequences has China paid for any of that behavior? They're committing an ongoing genocide, and yet it's unlikely that the Biden administration will even enact a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. That's looking more and more unlikely. So I would say that this is Xi Jinping, estimating that he can take this time as a kind of investment. I would call this, from Xi's perspective, a kind of investment, that he's taking the time to make sure that he has enough, that the structures in China's politics and economy are firm enough that they can shape the rest of the world, not just China itself. And I think what we're looking at here is a short-term tax in terms of, it appears that China might be turning in, or it appears, that there's struggles going on. Really what we're looking at is a kind of investment. And I see that over and over and over again, and especially if you view, China's engagement with the rest of the world through a broader lens. So, for example, their enormous successes in vaccine diplomacy, totally, outstretching the U.S. in that, even if their vaccine isn't as advanced or as good. You see that in the fact that despite of all of these crackdowns, on the Chinese economy, that U.S. investment in China grew in 2020, despite the pandemic, despite despite all the rhetoric from the Trump administration. And so even though you have, Xi trying to, having this maybe some domestic power struggles with like the tech industry, I would say that he has correctly judged that that is the correct thing to do in terms of China's position on the world stage. So from an outside perspective, that's would be my view.
So, Bethany, I think you're making an important point there on this issue of, has Xi succeeded in doing what he wants to do? And that's where I would say, just in terms of foreign policy, this is an international conversation, and tough rhetoric is one thing. I think the Chinese are very adept at looking past that or ignoring that, frankly. What's bluster? We've heard a lot of bluster, both from the Trump administration and now from the Biden administration. I feel like if you step out and you look at what's the last few years and what are we likely to look back at, we're likely to see not only a remarkable consolidation of power and the creation of a new cult of personality that's very worrisome around Xi Jinping, and the exploding of a recent tradition of stepping aside and collective decision making. So number one, I think we're going to remember that. But number two, it's very clear that he's gotten away with extraordinary things. And actually, the pandemic was not the only reason for it, but certainly seemed to accelerate his ability to undertake a series of extraordinary, not just authoritarian, but something far beyond that. I don't know what language we want to use for the 21st century, but putting 1 million people in camps is not just, garden variety authoritarianism, number one. Number two, using the pandemic essentially to finish and to accomplish the takeover of Hong Kong and the essentially abolition of guaranteed freedoms that the Chinese government had safeguarded and certainly didn't anticipate getting rid of this quickly. That's a big deal. Where was Donald Trump and his administration? Nowhere. Where, he even seemed at points to cheer it on. And now you have Biden, who's used a very polarizing rhetoric, actually, and said that this is a new competition between authoritarians and democracies in the West. And yet the narrative here has been about the weakness inside our own democracy and our inability, in fact, to take collective action to actually do anything meaningful to change this trajectory inside China. So anyways, I think that there's a lot of noise in our politics. I can't tell you, I'm not, the sort of Chinese Kremlinologist. I can't tell you why she is or isn't traveling outside the country right now and whether that has any significance at all. But I think we can already say pretty clearly that those two major developments have occurred in the last few years, and they might end up being actually the biggest geopolitical developments of the last few years.
Just to build on your point, Susan, because obviously we have this quote unquote summit meeting on Monday, where Biden is talking virtually with Xi. I mean, two things are going to come up that really emphasize your point, which is one, he's going to get invited to the Olympics, apparently. Now, can Biden say no? I mean, as Bethany said, it looks like they're not going to say no. They're going to, and even though they sent, degraded diplomatic missions to, for instance, the Sochi Olympics in Russia, they're not going to do that with China. The second thing is that he's under intense pressure now because of the inflation numbers to get rid of all the Chinese tariffs. And this was the one tool that they were trying to use on a trade economic point of view to really have some leverage with the Chinese. But suddenly, domestically, you're seeing corporate America go to him and says, "You have to stop this. We are now seeing spike in inflation. The tariffs are contributing to that." And so he's in an incredibly weak position. As you say, Susan, she is basically going to get away with an unprecedented, genocide, as the U.S. government has called it, and taking over Hong Kong without any consequences. It's a really amazing feat.
I think that's fascinating. I think that's exactly right. But it still does come to, I think, an assessment, Bethany, in the end of what is leading to the greater authoritarianism, almost totalitarianism. I think, the market economy is the one thing that sort of falls outside of the definition of totalitarian power, but the cult of personality, the Leninist party, and the control that it has. And the centrality of the Communist Party coming back in China. And I guess the question that all of us are grappling with is this from weakness or is it from strength? Is the consolidation a sign that he is just very, very confident in his abilities, or is it in fact some sign that he needs to consolidate power because he's worried about the opposition? And and I think there's a debate in China watching community with somebody like Kevin Rudd warning repeatedly that maybe he is actually weak and maybe in fact he won't survive past 2022. And I think he probably in the last few weeks might say the chances of survival are pretty larger. But Bethany, your argument is it's actually from a basis of strength. Right. And that makes a huge difference for how the U.S. needs to deal with it in the way that Peter and Susan have made that case. Why is the case for weakness not strong in your view? Why is this a strength building to consolidation rather than weakness?
Well, I think it's really helpful to imagine that China were a different country. Imagine that he was taking all of the actions he was taking and just ignoring for the moment the most extreme, such as what's happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, for example. Look at the way he is using the party to restructure the economy while maintaining a strong forward motion in China's economic growth. Look at the way that he has greatly strengthened the Chinese diplomatic stance in the world. Look at the way that he has created new structures and new concepts for using a partial market economy as a way to project international sway. Look at the new ways that he has brought, to thinking about Chinese power in the 21st century that have been successful. If we were to just look at those things, we would say, well, that's clearly from a position of strength simply because he's accomplishing things that work. And he has a very clearly a total dominance of mostly dominance of the party apparatus and has solidified that over time. Now, does he have an element of paranoia? I'm sure he does. So let's, but returning to the most extreme examples, the genocide in Xinjiang and the way that he has abrogated the treaty with Britain, in Hong Kong. Again, from an international perspective, that is from a position of strength. I think he made the estimation that he could do what he did in Hong Kong and receive absolutely zero consequences for it on the international stage, and that is exactly what has happened. They have received zero consequences for that, except for a few small sanctions on individuals, which are not significant. They're mostly symbolic. But if the question is China about to collapse politically from the inside, I would say point me to the evidence. Point me to a single piece of evidence. Every single time we've seen a powerful person come out and criticize Xi Jinping. So, and including strong economic figures. Who was the real estate guy last year? But like Cai Xia, an important high-level party insider, Guo Wengui, over and over and over again, we see these who would have been the power centers that challenged Xi falling like dominoes over and over and over again. I see no evidence to back the claim that he's weak, only speculation.
Can I just make a point that transitions in a way to our next conversation
Yeah,
about
great,
Russia?
please do. Yeah,
because
perfect.
having sort of watched a version of this conversation play out over 2 decades involving Vladimir Putin, now again a very different country. Russia is a much weaker country with a totally different kind of economy and no kind of ideologically driven party apparatus anymore in the wake of the Soviet collapse. But there is an echo of this debate that we've heard for 20 years around is Putin weak or is he strong, right? Is he consolidating power out of weakness or out of strength? Is he taking actions overseas? For example, the invasion of Ukraine and takeover of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, is that out of strength? Because it's just Putin finally doing what he wants to do and what he's always said he would like to do, which is to rebuild, in effect, a modern version of the Soviet and Russian Empire? Or is it out of weakness because, in fact, that invasion of Crimea took place in the aftermath of the most serious protests of Putin's tenure in his 2 decades in office, right? The answer is both things are true. And the smartest analysts that I've always relied on, and my thinking about Russia and the former Soviet Union point out that regime survival, regime legitimacy, is really been at the heart of many of Putin's actions over time. Not necessarily because he can fall at any moment, although remember he is informed by history. And I think has a clear sense that regimes in Russia are strong until they collapse instantly, right? There is a history of that. So the history is different in China, but certainly that means also that those around Xi Jinping are aware of the history, the dangers of charismatic single person rule in a country that has the Cultural Revolution very much in living memory. Remember that, people in Russia might talk about, the excesses of Stalinism in 1937 and whispers at the kitchen table, but, that had receded very, very far. And in fact, it was Putin's ability to recycle and rewrite Soviet history as a sort of nostalgic, kind of good time when everybody loved each other and you hung out with your grandparents at the kitchen table. It was his ability to sort of rewrite the Soviet Union without the bad parts. That has empowered his rule. I don't have the background to say how the history factor plays out, but I do think it shapes our analyses of Xi. And I definitely think we have to be prepared for the idea that this is not a zero-sum thing, right? That you're either strong or weak.
That's a great point. Love that.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. It probably is a bit of both, and it always is a bit of both. And if only through paranoia, which comes from a sense of worry about being weak, even if you're very strong. But as we know, even real paranoids have enemies. So it's not inconceivable. And I think the analogy with Putin is exactly right. So Susan, since we made the transition, let's go all the way, because you tweeted over the week, and I know that you're talking to folks, and we all are. There's a real sense of disquiet in Washington, in particular, that I think is now being shared with friends in Europe. Over what Russia is up to. extraordinary steps are being taken, sending the CIA director to Moscow, et cetera. But what are you hearing, and why? Is it all about Ukraine? Is it about something different? What are you seeing, but below the surface, because it really hasn't penetrated, in my view, sort of through the front pages of the newspapers yet. But if you talk to officials in Washington, they're worried that something big is happening.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Ivo. I think, look, you could, if you just take these sort of brewing crises separately, the picture might not add up to something that you really understand what it is, right? So you can talk about a kind of what's this border crisis between Belarus and Poland? I mean, how much do people in Washington really, give a damn, frankly, about a border crisis between Belarus and Poland? What is this about, Russian exercises once again on the border with Ukraine? Well, didn't we have this scare, a few months ago in the spring, and the Russians backed down? What is this issue with the gas pipeline and Europe and worries? Right, those are the three main buckets here of what appears to me, I think, and you said correctly, an interlocking set of crises where it's not really just about Belarus and migrants. It's not really just about gas and Europe, and it's not really just about Russia and Ukraine rerunning the same play once again. So I would say that Russia is at the center of all three of those crises. Number one. Number two, I absolutely agree. The sense of unease and concern escalating in Washington is something we haven't seen. This is a new level, even more so than in the spring when Russia was engaging in very large scale and threatening exercises on the border of Ukraine. Those were more or less done openly. They seem to be, in that sense, as much a messaging and signaling operation. Remember that when Putin actually did invade and take over the Crimean Peninsula, that was a surprise. It wasn't something that they just, let unfold in essentially full public view for weeks. It was a lightning takeover, so this is different from that. These are much more stealthy operations, I'm told. And the Biden administration's response is different than it was in the spring. Sending the CIA director is a very, I think, significant and interesting move on the part of the Biden administration. Bill Burns has really been playing this role of almost global diplomatic firefighter in addition to the role of CIA director. He was, perhaps America's most senior and respected diplomat. You know that well. You worked with him, and he was the ambassador to Russia and a career-long Russia hand, actually, inside the State Department. So, he's almost, taking on that other role. And remember, Vladimir Putin, the former KGB spy, this is a language that he speaks, like the idea of America commingling a spy and a diplomat is perfect stuff for the Russians. And actually, who did Bill Burns meet? He met with a major power broker inside Putin's Kremlin, and that's Nikolai Patrushev, who, now has a more general national security title, but in fact, was a leading foreign spy chief for much of Putin's 2-decade tenure. So again, very interesting move, very different than what we saw in the spring. And to your point, the alarm is now being sounded, as I understand, in Brussels as well, and with European allies. Americans, are saying, listen, these are very concerning, worrisome intelligence. One other thing I would point out, so you have the Ukrainians who remain extremely concerned. People have forgotten about it. There is a real war happening on the borders of Europe itself today. Not a Cold War, but a hot war that's been going on for years, ever since 2014, with Russian-backed separatists in the east of Ukraine. Russia has the ability, potentially at any moment, to change the balance of forces there if they were to inject a large number of direct Russian military into the conflict. That could be very destabilizing. Ukraine is partnered with the United States and other Western allies, but is not a formal member of NATO. There's no prospects of that happening anytime soon. Who would come to Ukraine's defense? I mean, you're talking about a situation where Russia actually has the ability to invade this country. I've seen some speculation, well, they couldn't keep it. Fair enough. It would be a big disaster. But the prospect is real there, number one. Number two, I think this situation with Belarus is very interesting, and it represents what the Poles are calling a new form of hybrid warfare. Essentially, I saw someone else write about it this week as the weaponization of human beings and human trafficking by a government. This is an extraordinary thing. Essentially, Belarus has increasingly become an outlaw regime. People have forgotten about it, but people in Eastern Europe haven't. Belarus forced down a plane. Remember that? Forced down a plane and basically grabbed a dissident journalist off of the airplane on a European airliner. It's become increasingly an isolated rogue state ever since then, but with powerful backing from Russia. Now they're doing another extraordinary thing. Just like forcing down a plane is extraordinary, they are literally taking hundreds and thousands of Middle Eastern migrants. They're encouraging them to come to Belarus, giving out visas and the like, sending these poor people from Iraqi Kurdistan into the freezing winter cold at the border of the European Union with Poland and Lithuania, and basically throwing them at the gates of Europe. This is first of all, it's a human rights violation on a massive scale. Second of all, it really portends a kind of disruptive frame for how we're thinking about, security in this day and age. And it just, it's a very significant new kind of attack I think we're seeing from an outlaw regime, and it wouldn't be happening if Vladimir Putin wasn't supporting it. So I'll leave it at that. But I think this is a very interesting and important crisis.
Susan, can I ask you? I mean, again, it requires you getting in the brain, but as you mentioned, all three of these interlocking crises, from the clearly the one in Ukraine, where the Russians are actively sending troops around, to the energy crisis, where, depending on which analyst you talk to, the Gazprom is intentionally withholding deliveries to Europe, although frankly there is also evidence that they don't have enough gas to supply Europe. That's another issue. And then, as you say, Lukashenko would not be doing this without some tacit approval from the Kremlin. Why? Why is these are all almost voluntary things that Putin has decided to do? What is behind the motivation here? Is it a Kim Jong-un, I just wanted some attention here, no one's paying attention to me kind of thing? Or why do you think now, and why these three things?
So that is the great question, Peter. One point I do want to make is that remember, the first crisis happened in the spring, right before Joe Biden made the kind of surprising decision to have an early summit with Putin. What did Joe Biden say coming out of that summit, and what was his goal then? It was to have not good, but stable and predictable relations with Vladimir Putin. Well, none of this is stable and predictable, right? This is very unpredictable. And by the way, unpredictability has been, before there was Donald Trump, right? There was Vladimir Putin, and unpredictability was his brand on the global stage. And so, one thing I think is Putin reestablishing, I'm not just going to be quietly sitting in a corner of Europe and, you're obsessing about Xi Jinping and China, So I agree that it's certainly a hallmark of what we've seen from Russia geopolitically, to not want to sit quietly in a corner. It is a rebuke of Joe Biden and his diplomacy. Absolutely. It is designed in part clearly to say this is not a stable and predictable relationship, number one. Number two, I do think this is a form of Putin negotiating. Certainly it's consistent with Putin when he wants or needs something globally, that he would take a number of potentially destabilizing actions while still remaining the power to turn that off, right? So he still has the power to recalibrate, right? And to, give as a concession this. The other thing that's happening is that, the players that he's used to are changing. Angela Merkel has been his main interlocutor on the world stage, really even more so than the American leaders. And she's retiring after this extraordinary run as chancellor, and Germany remains the big powerhouse in Putin's neighborhood. So partially there's some signaling going on there, I would imagine. But the question is, if Putin wants something, if he's, trying to negotiate, what does he want? And that's the part that I don't have an answer for.
Well, on the gas part, he clearly wants Nord Stream 2 to be certified, so he can have that done. But there is a third possible explanation that sort of links the conversation we just had on China, which is that China has proven that if you push hard enough, nobody's pushing back, and that was true under Trump, and it's true under Biden. And in some ways, this almost is like 1961 and Khrushchev for Kennedy, where Khrushchev was testing Kennedy and thought he could get away with it, ultimately, but putting missiles in Cuba, which he didn't get away with. But the sense that maybe the U.S. and its allies aren't projecting strength sufficiently for someone to be deterred or prevented from doing so. That's certainly what you would hear and do already hear on the other side of the political aisle in the United States, but it's also what you're starting to hear from Europeans. Where is the United States? And Peter, just reflect on that, but also sort of on this border crisis, which is as Susan, I think, nicely summarized, but is really a challenge not just to the United States, but to the European Union and to NATO.
Well, 2 points on that to react to Ivo, because I really do agree with your first point on this. Because if we take Bethany's argument, is that she is moving from a position of strength, and therefore feels there's no repercussions to going into Hong Kong, no repercussions to rounding up Uyghurs. You know what? Taiwan has suddenly seen a huge influx in Chinese overflights by fighter jets. There's going to become a Munich moment here, right? I mean, I think both on Russia and on China. We may, Susan, you were talking about looking back and what it might look like in 10 years. There may have happened already a Munich moment here where we decided to sue for peace with a totalitarian dictator, and they just decided that we're going to roll all over you. So I think the unwillingness for Europe or the U.S. to stand up to Putin on either of these fronts, and she could be this red line, which gets, I think, to this point on Ukraine. I mean, on Belarus, and as Susan has talked mostly about what has happened here. But let me just take you back, because this is over a course of a year to 18 months. Let's remember, it started with Lukashenko basically fraudulently taking the presidential election. Protesters in the streets of Minsk, the opposition leader Tikhonovskaya being forced to flee to Vilnius. There was a moment here where, with a little bit of pushing, I think, from the U.S., from Europe, we could have seen another colored revolution, and that was the fear, clearly, where Putin stepped in and backed Lukashenko. But no one did it. Both, I think, I would argue, fecklessness on the part of the Europeans, but also tail end Trump, a little bit distracted. I've been surprised, though, from day one, there was not more assertive stance taken by the Biden administration, because this was his thing, right? We are going to be the country that reasserts American democracy, democratic values, and human rights. And I remember I met Tikhonovskaya shortly after I got my vaccine, about sort of May of this year. And I said, "Oh, so how have things gone with the Biden administration?" And she said, "We haven't heard from them yet." And this is, I would thought of in day one, send someone to Vilnius to stand next to Tikhonovskaya and the opposition leaders and say, "Hey, we're with you." And the same thing on Ukraine. The guy couldn't get a meeting in the White House until 8-9 months into the administration. So there's been for some reason, and as Susan mentioned, a willingness to hold the summit. There's been some reason, an unwillingness to stand up to Lukashenko on Belarus and to the Russians on Ukraine. And what we've seen is, much like Lukashenko just keeps pushing, right? As Susan says, there's this Ryanair flight from Athens where Tikhonovskaya's aide was seized. I was at that conference in Athens, is why we met. And now, hey, by the way, let's fly a bunch of Syrians and Yemenis and Iraqs on Turkish Airlines, which has a code-sharing arrangement with the Belarusian airlines, to Minsk, and then beginning pushing over the border. This is a NATO border, right? And Susan points out that Ukraine, not a member of NATO, so war Ukraine is a little bit more amorphous. The Poland-Belarus border is a NATO border. I have been there, and the one on Lithuania as well. And suddenly you're seeing armed troops, NATO troops, Polish troops, sort of nose to nose with armed troops of the Belarusian army, who are pushing these refugees over the border. And so I think you're right, Ivo, particularly that we may not be paying attention to this as much as we probably should have in Washington and the U.S., but this has suddenly become issue number one in Europe, because everyone remembers what happened the last time there was an immigration crisis in 2014 in Europe, which is the rise of Marine Le Pen, the rise of Alternative für Deutschland, the rise of Matteo Salvini in Italy, the rise of the far right in European politics. We've seen a bit of a calming of the waters there with the rise of Macron, and even the German elections. AfD did very badly, and the polling numbers for Le Pen against Macron next year is not doing so well. But they are acutely aware that if suddenly we see, and they're chanting at the Ukrainian at the Polish bus, they're chanting Deutschland. I mean, the Belarusians are clearly trying to aim this at Germany and to destabilize the Germans, so that they don't go another round of sanctions, or they pull back some of the sanctions that happened after the Ryanair jet was seized. This is, to me, to your point originally, Ivo, you start giving in to people, be it Xi, be it Putin, early on. It's very hard to catch up. It's very hard to catch up. And you do end up with questions about whether we reached a bit of a Munich moment here, that we become so weak and so disorganized and so unwilling to push back on any of this stuff that we've lost the window to react to this. And both Lukashenko as a proxy for Putin and Xi are taking advantage of that.
So Bethany, clearly the folks in Beijing are watching this, and I've been struck by the sense in Beijing to come forward and say the United States is in decline, the West is in decline, and not just to demonstrate that Beijing and China is rising and strong, the point you just already made, but this other sense of decline. Do they see what's happening as further evidence that somehow the United States and its European allies can't get their act together, that you can get away, they proved they could get away with the Uyghur issue, with, of course, Hong Kong, but then Putin can get away with a whole bunch of stuff too. Does that reinforces the narrative, or is this a part of the world that people are not paying attention to in Beijing? How does that work?
No, I would definitely agree with that analysis, that leaders in Beijing do clearly see U.S. decline and Western decline, and they talk about it. And in fact, they have for a while. Back a few years ago, I did a keyword search of Chinese state media. I think it was People's Daily, for the phrase American decline, and you could see how the phrase was used more frequently over the years, especially starting after the financial crisis in 2008. As Peter mentioned, Taiwan is an issue that is really rising as a possible flashpoint. And I think the reason for that is that China just doesn't really believe that the US would sacrifice our blood and treasure after we did that for 20 years in the Middle East with nothing to show for it. I think it's really hard for them to believe that we would do that. But that's not far from the only evidence they see for Western weakness. And I definitely understand why that has been their analysis. But I would say here, I would strongly caveat that on a couple of points, maybe 3 points. So the first is that the extensive censorship in China, the strong sense of paranoia among top leaders, the heavy propaganda and censorship is, I think, clouding people's assessment, one, of how popular China is in the world, and two, of some of the actual strengths that the US and Western countries maintain, such as the resilience of our civil societies. And an example of this is that from Beijing's perspective, and indeed from the perspective of many Chinese people who've never left China, the Black Lives Matter movement is evidence of weakness and collapse. And I would say, my strong feeling, and that it is evidence of our strength as a society and our ability to renew ourselves and to address our own systemic problems. That if we did not have the Black Lives Matter movement, that would be evidence of a fragility and a brittleness in our society. So I think there's an underestimation of some of our strengths from China. And another thing I would caveat that with is that China continues to see itself as an underdog. And this is like, if you can sort of sit in Beijing and view the US as an enemy, it's easy to see why they would feel that way. We have the world's most formidable intelligence agencies. We have the world's most formidable military and the strongest diplomatic alliances. And so while they have clearly identified US decline, and 2020 during the pandemic, I think, was sort of the peak moment for that, I think they do know, and I think that we should take heart that it's not over yet, and I think things are just going to be different rather than just sort of this kind of movement.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, because a little optimism, in the sense that we
need it, Ivo. We need it.
No, but
curmudgeon group.
It is complicated, but it also means that there are inherent strengths, that those strengths can be marshaled, and they need to be marshaled in an effective way, both to compete effectively with China, and of course to address the crisis that's coming from from the Soviet Union. There I go. From Russia, semi-Soviet Union these days.
Soviet Union Mach 2, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there are real strengths, but the real question is, do we have the capacity politically and diplomatically to marshal those strengths to an effective strategy? And we've seen that at times working, and other times we haven't. We'll be back, therefore, talking about all of these crises and the relative effectiveness of American power in those areas next week, when we'll have another edition of World Review. But for this week, I want to thank Susan Glasser, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, and Peter Spiegel for their incredible insight today on these really complicated issues. Terrific conversation. Want to wish you all a great weekend. And to those of you watching, come back next week. We'll be back again for another edition of World Review. Thank you all.